South Africa has always been and always will be an incredibly rich and diverse country, culturally and demographically heterogeneous, naturally lush and variegated, and historically rich with both strife and triumph. This country never ceases to impress and leave its seal in history. Together with its unique climatology, the country is ideal for a great variety of agricultural practices, one of which is its viticultural industry. South Africa has for hundreds of years been one of the most competitive wine industries in the world, with celebrated, high-quality white and red wines. However, despite the country's natural diversity and agricultural and commercial potential, South Africa's history is plagued by various well-known atrocities against humanity. Starting with the introduction of slavery since the establishment of the first large European settlement in the Cape Colony by the Dutch East India Company, to the segregationist policies of Cecil John Rhodes and the Afrikaner government after the Union of South Africa, and finally to the racial and segregationist atrocities under the apartheid government in the latter half of the 20th century, South Africa's eventual political and institutional enlightenment after its transition into a liberal democracy in 1994 had centuries of structural and institutional segregation and racial discrimination to make up for if it was going to become a peaceful and functioning state in a hyper-capitalist and liberal democratic world. As mentioned earlier, South Africa is internationally recognized for its viticultural heritage. However, this heritage was built on a history of slavery and racial discrimination and segregation. Thus, a new democratic South Africa would have to reform its wine industry to fit the larger societal changes taking place around it. This large-scale structural reform that was aimed at making the country's wine industry more inclusive and egalitarian was Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE. In context of South Africa's wine industry, this legislation was aimed at putting a sizable portion of South Africa's viticulture in the hands of those who were historically disadvantaged and disenfranchised due to the country's structural history of racial segregation, most notably referring to the black demographic majority. However, the question remains whether these structural adjustments in the country's wine industry have been as successful as initially hoped for. The history of viticulture in South Africa can be traced back to the mid-17th century, where the VOC established an outpost at what was then named the Cape of Good Hope. The outpost had key geopolitical strategic value, as it allowed the VOC to bypass the traditional routes along the east coast of Africa to India, and therefore strong Portuguese and British naval armies, whereupon Dutch ships would sail straight towards the Australian west coast before turning north towards the Dutch outposts of Java and Sumatra. One of the most prominent agricultural practices initiated by the VOC in the Cape was certainly that of viticulture, which continues and certainly maintains its prestigious heritage well into the 21st century in what is today the province of the Western Cape in South Africa. Upon its official establishment in 1652, the VOC appointed Jan van Riebeeck as the first commander of the Cape Colony. Van Riebeeck soon realized that the climate and soil of the Cape was ideal for viticultural practices and commenced with the planting of Vitis vinifera in 1655 on Wynberg. Although Van Riebeeck was responsible for the first wine produced in the Cape, it was the 10th commander and first governor of the Cape Colony, Simon van der Stel, who is overwhelmingly considered to be the founding father of South African wine. Van der Stel's immediate objective as overseer of the Cape Colony was to expand on the colony's agricultural and viticultural practices. He was the founder of Stellenbosch, which is today the heart of South Africa's wine industry. One of the largest and most prominent viticultural estates was granted to and established by van der Stel himself, known then and now as Constantia, to which he retired in 1699. After Simon van der Stel's death in 1712, Constantia was divided in three parts, namely Bergvliet, Klein Constantia, and Constantia. The quality and trade of wine in the Cape Colony evolved rapidly after the introduction of British rule, of which the first couple of decades were a golden age for Constantia and other South African wines. Among the reasons for this prosperity was the regulations and quality standards that the British government imposed on the industry. Despite the failed harvest in the early 19th century, demand for Constantia wine was higher than ever, and orders for both white and red wine was coming in from all around the world. However, come the middle of the 19th century, there were numerous factors that threatened the South African wine industry. Of the economic and political factors, it was the First and Second World Wars and the Great Depression after the Wall Street crash of 1929, all of which had large-scale global poverty and prohibitions to alcohol production, consumption, and sales to varying degrees. But it was the political events within South Africa that had the biggest effects on the country's wine industry, most notably the creation of the South African Union in 1910 and the subsequent discriminatory racial segregationist legislation that was created, enforced, and amended throughout the course of the next century, which eventually culminated in apartheid. The racist legislation that dominated the country's political scene throughout the 20th century had the consequence of various economic sanctions and boycotts from all around the world, which meant the serious processual banning of South African wine imports across the globe. On the one hand, this meant that South Africa had a vastly reduced market in which to sell its wines, but it also meant that the country had a very substantial wine surplus, which naturally led to a fall in the prices and quality of South African wine. This in turn led to a creation of the Caveat by Charles Koller in 1918, an institutional initiative that aimed to improve cooperation among wine farmers, get rid of wine surpluses, raise the quality of wines and brandies, and open new international markets for South African wine. The influence and authority of the Caveat quickly grew within a few years, and by 1924, about 95% of South African wine farms belonged to the Caveat, and Caveat itself became a major distiller. South African wines continued to flourish under the Caveat throughout the remainder of the 20th century, and the Constantia name was revived, as well as when Klein Constantia was rebought and reworked in 1913. But it wasn't until the early 1980s that Klein Constantia started to win acclaim for the fine quality of its wines. In the end of the 20th century, and largely due to an almost universal lift of economic sanctions and a boom in foreign direct investment from around the world in South African viticulture, the end of apartheid and the major democratic transition brought about major structural reforms that would impact South Africa's wine industry in a major way. Foremost of these, and the very one that forms the subject of this study, is black economic empowerment. After the Caveat was officially allowed to transfer from a cooperative to an independent company in 1997, it was agreed that Caveat would have various responsibilities towards the South African wine industry, especially regarding concerns from its contenders concerning its vivacious monopoly of the country's wine industry, specifically in terms of production, asset management, and research and development. One of these major responsibilities would be the contribution of 369 million rands towards the South African Wine Industry Trust, which was officially set up in 1999. The best and quickest way to the empowerment of those who were historically disadvantaged and disenfranchised is to transfer a respectable amount of a company's shares to those of color. In the case of South Africa, those black persons who now own a share of the ownership of companies might provide opportunities and benefits to a broad constituency of those who form part of who the BEE initiative seeks to empower. By 2003, the institutional conditions for empowerment in the South African wine industry was in place. Between 2004 and 2005, deals were brokered that allowed more than a quarter of the shares of Caveat to be sold to black individuals and black-led bodies and companies. Although the deal was eventually brokered and 25+% of Caveat shares are owned by black businesses, there were still worries that the black ownership in South Africa's wine industry still only translates to wealth being pocketed and influence being shared by the high echelons of South Africa's class hierarchy, regardless of race, and that the already impoverished and disempowered remain poor and powerless. Regardless of these concerns regarding the overall wealth distribution and whether BEE in the country's wine industry or otherwise actually initiates, advances and maintains structural reforms, the Caviar BEE deal is a remarkable achievement, whether we look at it from a short, medium or long term. It closes a process of transformation that began in 1996 but had its origins well before that, and it sets an example for future changes in the wine industry and in agriculture more generally. South Africa has a major historical heritage when it comes to its viticultural industry, and although much of it was built on racial injustice, recent structural reform embodied by the BEE policy has ensured that the future of South Africa's wine industry will benefit the whole of the South African demographic and work towards the reparation and reconciliation of the South African economy and agricultural sector.